At a bustling corporate headquarters in the heart of New York City, CEO Richard Coleman was known for his no-nonsense leadership style. To him, efficiency and power were everything, and he had little patience for those he deemed insignificant. One afternoon, as he hurried into the building, he encountered an older security guard standing at the entrance. The man's uniform was slightly worn, his posture firm yet calm. Without hesitation, Richard berated him over a minor issue, raising his voice in front of employees and visitors. He had no idea that the man he was humiliating was a decorated war veteran, someone who had once stood on the front lines defending the very country that allowed Richard to thrive. What happened next would leave everyone in shock. The lobby fell silent as Richard Coleman's voice echoed through the marble-floored entrance. The security guard, whose name tag read Thomas Miller, remained composed despite the public humiliation. He had faced far worse in his lifetime: combat zones, loss, and the heavy burden of duty. A few employees exchanged nervous glances, sensing that Richard had crossed a line, but no one dared to intervene. Thomas simply nodded and responded calmly, "I'm just doing my job, sir." His voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had seen true hardship. Richard scoffed. "Doing your job? Maybe if you were more competent, you wouldn't be standing here in a security uniform." A few chuckles escaped from bystanders, emboldening the CEO's arrogance. Just then, one of the executives, David Harper, stepped forward hesitantly. Mr. Coleman, you might want to reconsider your words." Richard turned sharply. "And why is that?" David swallowed before speaking. "Thomas isn't just any security guard. He's a retired Marine, served for over 20 years. He's been awarded multiple honors, including a Silver Star for bravery." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard's expression faltered for the first time. Thomas remained silent, his gaze steady but unreadable. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. Employees who had once stood idly by now looked at Thomas with newfound respect. Richard, however, struggled to process the moment. But the consequences of his actions were just beginning. A heavy silence filled the air as Richard Coleman's arrogant smirk slowly faded. His eyes darted around, realizing that the mood in the lobby had shifted. No one was laughing anymore. The employees who once seemed entertained now looked at him with quiet disapproval. Thomas Miller stood still, his expression unreadable. He had endured far worse than an arrogant CEO barking orders, but something in his weathered eyes made Richard uneasy. The CEO swallowed, his confidence momentarily shaken, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Well," Richard cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle, "that doesn't change the fact that he's working security now, does it?" A tense murmur rippled through the crowd. Some employees exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked outright disgusted. David Harper, the executive who had spoken up earlier, took a step closer, his voice firmer now. "With all due respect, sir," David said, his jaw tight, "it changes everything." Thomas finally spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of experience. "Mr. Coleman, I don't need your respect, and I certainly don't expect it. But what I do expect is basic decency. Not for me, but for every person who works in this building." Richard opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Miller?" A woman's voice rang out, A younger employee, no older than 30, stepped forward. Were you stationed in Fallujah in 2004? Thomas blinked, surprised. Yes, I was. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photo. My father was there too, Sergeant Daniel Reeves. He used to tell me about a soldier who saved his life during an ambush. Said he never got to thank him. She swallowed hard, looking at Thomas with wide, tear-filled eyes. Was that you? The entire room was still. Thomas took a slow breath, glancing down at the photo. His face softened as recognition dawned. Sergeant Reeves, he was a good man, one of the best. He looked up at her. I remember that day. The young woman wiped a tear from her cheek, then turned to Richard, her voice sharp. This man is a hero. He's the reason my father came home. The weight of her words crashed over the room like a tidal wave. Even Richard, for all his arrogance, felt the shift. His face burned with shame, but his pride held him back from admitting fault. Thomas, however, simply gave a small nod. I was just doing my job, he said again. But this time, his words carried a different meaning. Richard felt the stares pressing in on him, the realization that he had humiliated a man far greater than himself. His throat felt dry. For the first time in a long time, he was at a loss for words. And then the consequences truly began. A thick, suffocating silence settled in the lobby. Richard Coleman shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. His usual confidence, the air of superiority he carried like armor, had cracked. His face was pale, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. David Harper, still standing beside Thomas Miller, crossed his arms. His expression wasn't one of anger, it was disappointment, and that somehow cut deeper. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. Look, he hesitated, his voice faltering. The words of an apology were foreign to him, stuck in his throat like jagged glass. Before he could finish, Thomas took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. Despite his age, he carried himself with the quiet strength of a man who had faced real battles, both on the battlefield and in life. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even offended. He simply looked tired. You know, Thomas began, his voice calm, I've seen men who had everything, power, money, success, lose it all because they forgot what truly mattered. He glanced at Richard, his expression unreadable. Respect isn't given because of a title. It's earned. Richard stiffened, but he said nothing. Thomas exhaled, then turned to the young woman still holding her father's photo. He gave her a small nod, then placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Your father was a good man. I'm honored to have served with him. Tears welled in her eyes again, but she smiled. Thank you, she whispered. The tension in the room was unbearable. Employees who once feared speaking up now looked at their CEO differently. The whispers were growing, low murmurs of discontent, of disbelief at how their leader had treated a man like Thomas. And then the consequences began. A senior executive, an older man with salt and pepper hair, stepped forward. Richard, he said evenly, we need to talk. Now. Richard's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. Damage control. Meetings. Maybe even a board review. But worse than that was the realization that his people, his employees, were seeing him for what he truly was, and they would never look at him the same way again. Richard Coleman clenched his jaw, feeling a cold sweat forming at the back of his neck. The senior executive, Mark Reynolds, was staring at him with an expression that Richard had never seen before. Disappointment mixed with something else. Finality. "We need to talk. Now." Mark's tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Richard swallowed hard. He was used to being in control, dictating how conversations unfolded. But now, for the first time in years, he felt small, powerless. He turned toward the elevator, muttering, "Fine." As he stepped inside, he cast one last glance at the lobby. The employees weren't just whispering anymore. They were watching. Their eyes weren't filled with fear or admiration like before. No, now they looked at him with something far worse: contempt. Thomas Miller, however, simply shook his head. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smirking. He had nothing to prove. That somehow made it worse. The elevator doors slid shut. Upstairs, in the executive conference room, Richard sat across from Mark and two other board members. The atmosphere was suffocating. "You do realize what just happened down there, don't you?" Mark asked, his voice eerily calm. Richard scoffed, trying to mask his unease. "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" One of the board members, Susan Caldwell, leaned forward. "You publicly humiliated a decorated veteran in front of half the company. And now, thanks to modern technology, that little scene of yours is probably already viral." Richard's stomach dropped. He hadn't even considered that. He reached for his phone, but before he could unlock it, Mark slid his own across the table. The screen showed a video no more than a few minutes old. It was already gaining traction online. The title was brutal: "CEO humiliates war hero, instantly regrets it." Richard's face burned with shame as he watched himself sneering at Thomas. The arrogance, the cruelty, it was all there, frozen in time, replaying over and over. He barely recognized himself. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're going to have to do serious damage control." "I'll issue a statement," Richard said quickly. "I'll say I didn't know." "That's not going to be enough," Susan interrupted. "You've made this company look heartless. Our investors are already asking questions." Richard's mind raced. His reputation, his power, it was all slipping through his fingers. Mark folded his arms. "You have two choices, Richard." His tone was deadly serious. "Step up, own your mistake, and make things right. Or," he let the silence hang for a moment, "the board will have no choice but to reconsider your position." Richard's breath caught in his throat. He had never imagined a day when his own company, the empire he had built, would turn on him. His fingers curled into fists. "What do you expect me to do?" he asked, his voice low. Susan gave him a hard look. "Start with an apology. A real one." Mark nodded. "And not just words. Actions." Richard clenched his jaw. The thought of standing in front of his employees, in front of Thomas, and admitting he was wrong made his skin crawl. But for the first time in his life, he had no other choice. Richard Coleman had never apologized to anyone in his life. Not truly. But now, as he stood outside the security office, hands clammy, he realized he had no choice. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Thomas Miller sat at his desk, sipping a cup of coffee, his expression calm as ever. When Richard knocked, Thomas glanced up, his face unreadable. "Mr. Coleman," he said evenly. "Something I can help you with?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. He had spent years commanding boardrooms, making billion-dollar deals, and yet, standing before this man, this veteran, he felt completely out of his depth. "I need to talk," Richard said stiffly. Thomas nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Go ahead." Richard sat, exhaling slowly. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Then, finally, he spoke. "Look, I was out of line," he admitted, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "I didn't know who you were, and that's not an excuse. The way I treated you was unacceptable." Thomas didn't react immediately. He simply took another sip of coffee before setting the cup down. "It's not about who I am, Mr. Coleman," he said. "It's about how you treat people, period." Richard swallowed hard. He expected anger, maybe resentment, but instead, there was only quiet wisdom in Thomas's eyes. "I spent years leading men into situations where life and death were a coin flip," Thomas continued. "Out there, rank and titles didn't matter. What mattered was respect, integrity. A leader isn't measured by how much power they hold, but by how they treat the people under them." He let the words sink in before adding, "That's a lesson you might want to learn." Richard looked down at his hands. He had spent his whole life chasing power, but what had it gotten him? A room full of employees who feared him, a board threatening to remove him, and now a reputation in free fall. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, and he didn't like what he saw. After a long pause, Richard met Thomas's gaze. "I want to make things right." Thomas studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then start by being better." The next morning, an email from Richard landed in every employee's inbox. Subject: an apology and a commitment. It was the first time anyone had seen him admit fault. He took full responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the toxic culture he had fostered. But it didn't stop at words. He announced a company-wide initiative to support veterans, offering job opportunities, leadership training, and mental health resources. And, in a surprising move, he pledged a personal donation to a foundation supporting retired service members. Later that day, Richard walked through the lobby, where Thomas stood at his usual post. For once, employees weren't scattering at the sight of their CEO. They were watching, waiting. Richard stopped in front of Thomas and extended his hand. "I was wrong," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm going to prove I can do better." Thomas studied him for a moment, then clasped his hand firmly. "We'll see." A flicker of something crossed Richard's face. Humility, perhaps. For the first time in his life, he wasn't demanding respect. He was earning it. As he walked away, the whispers in the lobby weren't of fear or contempt. They were of something new,